Hey guys, so we got a question today relating to this book, The Myth of the Eastern Front, the Nazi-Soviet War in American Popular Culture. So let me read the question. It's by Spencer. Here are the Amazon reviews for The Myth of the Eastern Front, and he's being sarcastic here, but he says, mindless consumerism and international Jewish finance, which is a quote from Mein Kampf. He then says, the credibility of Amazon reviewers notwithstanding, I wonder if you could briefly rebut the negative reviews. So just a bit of background. This book came out in 2008. It pretty much tackles a lot of issues, but it basically targets the Wehraboos, the people who think the Wehrmacht is like this great, amazing, tactical genius force of superhuman warriors, the greatest fighting force that ever existed. And before you laugh, no, people do actually think this. And if you criticize them, they will call you out as being pro-Soviet and anti-German and all this other rubbish. And so what I'm going to do first, before we get into the negative reviews, I'm going to read a positive review so you can see actually there are some people who think this book is good. It says, the truth about the Wehrmacht's role in Eastern Front atrocities. Because this is important, the Wehrmacht did participate in Eastern Front atrocities, not just the SS. So Smesler and Davies' book, The Myth of the Eastern Front, the Nazi-Soviet War in American Popular Culture, is an important look at the misrepresentation of history by both the victors and the vanquished alike. The author's central thesis is that the Wehrmacht was completely complicit in Hitler's war of aggression in the Soviet Union, and that after the key leaders of the United States and Western Europe fudged the historical record along with the German generals to lay blame for German atrocities in Russia at the hands of solely the SS, this view was established to exculpate the German military during the war, just as at the time West German military aid became essential during the Cold War. America and the West needed to undergo a psychological shift from seeing the Germans as the enemy of the Soviets and the Soviets as friends, to viewing the Germans as allies and the Soviets as a threat. The German generals complicit in the Nazi war crimes in Russia were only too happy to aid in this fraud. Memoirs such as that of Guderian and Manstein added to this altered historical record, along with the work Halder did for the US government on creating an official history of the war, a work for which he was personally decorated by President Eisenhower. The German army was an absolute master of the operational art, I actually disagree with this, but lacked the resources and technical training for the kind of intelligence and logistical work that is essential in modern warfare, and which benefited the Allies so well. When the decision to invade the Soviet Union was undertaken by Hitler, the General Staff knew the army couldn't efficiently feed and supply itself over such long lines of communication. This practical desire to keep the army fed and supplied meshed perfectly with Hitler's racial theories of Slavic inferiority and Nazi Prussian anti-communism. Therefore, the order to live off the land was given, effectively sentencing the Soviet peoples to a new program of terror, murder and violence. This is not a liberal or biased view, it is simply the truth. Every responsible historian today accepts it. See all of these guys, including Glantz, Eriksson, Kershaw. Eriksson was writing in the 70s, I believe. This list goes on. The authors include popular perceptions of the war on the Eastern Front today, in which history buffs and historical recreationalists view the war almost as that of a good Germans versus the evil Soviets. Hitler's destructive terror in the Soviet Union is in no way should erase the horrors inflicted upon the Soviet peoples by the Stalinist regime, but they do need to be properly recorded alongside them. A common scenario among these buffs, so the authors state, is the belief that if only Hitler had not meddled in the military affairs, the Germans would have defeated the Soviets, and the Cold War never would have occurred. The flaws of logic with those who romanticize the swastika are mind-boggling. This book is an important addition to the Second World War literature and the problems of modern popular historical perception. Highly recommended. The German Wehrmacht of the Second World War has been portrayed as like this greatest fighting force of ever, right? oh, it conquered left, right, and centre, and it did all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but it conquered because the enemies at the time in the early part of the war they made loads of mistakes and also hadn't prepared for war, unlike the Germans. So the Germans had a head start. But once the Allies and the Soviets got their act together, they quickly overwhelmed the Germans. And that's pretty much in a nutshell, pretty much the history of the Second World War. What this book calls out is the behaviour of some enthusiasts and history buffs who are whitewashing and making out that the German Wehrmacht was clean and that didn't participate in the Eastern Front atrocities. And they are using certain sources that back up that claim and then refuting anybody who uses, I say refute, they are dismissing anybody who uses sources which includes the Soviet sources, because you can't trust you can 100% trust the socialists in Germany, but you can't trust the socialists in the Soviet Union because reasons. And it is the third to last sentence here that is really telling. The flaws of logic with those who romanticize the swastika are mind-boggling. History theory says that you in order to have to get to the truth of history, you need to have arguments, right? You need to have two people arguing two different sides of an argument, and whichever side of the argument gives a better argument is the one you favour. Well, in order to have an argument, you need a decent argument, surprisingly. And so, you need what makes a good argument. Evidence, decent interpretation, and constructed in a nice, positive, good way of arguing, right? So you need a solid argument. So you need lots of evidence, you need lots of interpretation that makes sense. So when you have flaws in logic, and I've said this a million times, when there are flaws in logic, that is an indication that something has gone wrong in the argument, if it cannot be explained properly, right? So I'm not talking about, oh, I don't understand what you're saying here, can you please elaborate on that? It's not that, it's... So I'm just trying to think of an example. So let's take Manstein's view. So Manstein basically said in his book Lost Victories, bearing in mind the title of the book, Lost Victories, so he basically said if we had been allowed to retreat, we would have won, right? So the flaw in the logic there is, if we had retreated all the way to Berlin, we would have won the war. Like, yeah. And obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it is true. That's basically what Manstein was saying. That's why I parodied it in a recent video of mine. It's like, that's an exaggeration, but it's stupid. Like, the logic doesn't make any sense. Well, the same thing applies with what we're about to see here. So, I mean, this is the star rating. Currently 3 out of 5 on Amazon.com. And you can see a lot of 1-star reviews. So I'm going to only tackle a couple of them today because I can't sit here for 5 hours going through it, but I will go through a couple at least. So this is by a guy called Sudweeks. I assuming he's German because he's got Sud in the name, South, which means South in German. The previous negative reviews are spot on. Reviews, plural. I originally bought the book due to a commitment I made. I wanted to read books written by history professors, my history professors. That being said, this is my review. After reading this book and the reviews, I can say the negative reviews are spot on. I do not believe this book adds anything to the scholarly discussion. Right, so basically we can ignore all this because it's just not saying anything. The book is filled with bias. Right, okay, I've got news for you. All books are biased? Right, because history theory says humans are flawed creatures who have limited perspectives, who are not omnipotent gods and know everything, and so they can't see everything and know everything, and so they are biased. And since history is the study of the human record, right, it's not the study of the past, because you can't take the past and actually study it physically, because you can't unless you have a time machine. It's impossible. So we study the record of the past, things that have been left from the past, such as books, memoirs, statements, even physical objects like castles, for example. We study them to find out what humans of yesterday thought and how the past can be perceived, basically. So all sources are biased, okay? Every single one of them. Every single source. Everything that's ever been written down. Everything, like a castle is biased because it was built by people who had a limited perspective on the world. So everything, in that sense, is biased. So yes, saying that the book is filled with biases is true. That's why you need to read multiple books on the subject and not limit yourself to a select few books, like some of these gurus and romanticizers are doing when it comes to the Wehrmacht. So the book is filled with bias, obviously inductive reasoning, and blanket condemnation for German soldiers. Okay, clarification. The German soldiers of World War II on the Eastern Front committed horrendous crimes, and they all did it. Why? Because, so, when the Germans went east, they didn't have logistics, basically. They basically had very little logistics. They had trains and horses, and a few motor vehicles, but they only had enough oil to last till October of 1941. So they had only got a couple of months worth of fuel. And this was, most of their divisions weren't motorised. Most of their divisions were foot infantry. So they were reliant on horses and trains. And then when they went east, they realised, oh, actually, we won't be able to feed these people and give them ammunition and give them winter clothing and give them all this other stuff we need to give them. So we can't do that. So we need to ease the strain on the logistical chain. So what they did was they thought, well, hold on, why don't we not feed the German soldiers and let them live off the land? Oh, that's a great idea, and that ties in with Nazi policy because Hitler was going east for the food, okay? He was going for the food and the oil in the east, as well as other things, but the food and the oil crisis in Germany was absolutely dire, so that's why they're going east. That's part of the reason why they had to go in 1941. I've been over this in many videos. And so they went east and they said, right, the soldiers, we will feed them a little bit, but not properly because we want them to live off the land. So they were ordered to live off the land. So if the soldiers went east, they had a choice. They either starved to death or they kicked down the doors of peasants and farmers and they take the food off them and starve those in the east. And guess what they did? You guessed it. They starved the civilians of the east. And before you point out, because I've had this before, oh, TIK, you don't know, the Holodomor happened in the 1930s. But you're saying it's happened in the 1940s. Yes, because it did happen in the 1940s as well. Yes, the Holodomor happened in the 1930s. That was the Soviets' famine, yeah. And then you have the famine in the East during the 1940s as well. And that was perpetrated by the Germans and the Wehrmacht. And it did happen. There's plenty of records for it. You can read about it. Hitler's Beneficiaries by Ali. There's loads. That's a good one. So, yeah. So when we say blanket condemnation for German soldiers who went east, yeah. They basically kicked down the door and started pillaging of the east. Kharkov and Kiev were, the populations were depleted. And there was millions starved to death in the east. Not just in Russia, in Poland, Greece, and then later in the war in Holland as well. So, yeah, we can condemn the German soldiers because most of them actually participated in these events or helped, right? They fought on the same side as the people, right? So, yeah, somebody next to you might have committed the crime and you didn't commit the crime, but you were there helping them in one way or another, right? Because you were fighting on the same side. But that doesn't mean we condemn every single one of them, but it does mean that, yeah, you can say that the Wehrmacht wasn't a nice, lovely Wehrmacht that went east. No, that's not. That's a myth, right? And that part, this book exposes that myth. This guy, Sudviks, then goes on. At the same time, he has cherry-picked information to support his thesis. The way that history theory works. So we are, again, flawed human beings who cannot read everything. We can't read all the books that have ever been written on World War II. We can't read all the books that have ever been written in history. So we have to miss some of them out. We also don't have access to all the information in terms of sources and so on. We also don't have the ability, even if we had read all the books on World War II, every single one of them, we knew everything about it. If you are to write a book, however many pages, if you are to write one book on the topic, right, can you fit all the information you've ever known into that one book? No. So it is impossible to know everything. And even if you did, somehow, godlikely, you somehow knew everything, you could not make a book that had all that information in it. It's not physically, humanly possible, okay? So what authors do is they filter out the information, and so for example, Hitler we know was racist and he hated the Jews. So we know, right, that Hitler hates the Jews, and there's many instances where he says that he doesn't like Jews. Mein Kampf, second book, tons of speeches, etc. So if I said, well, Hitler doesn't like the Jews, here's 5 instances, right, here's 5 examples of that, and then say, hey, Hitler didn't like the Jews, it's like, oh, but, I mean, he didn't mention all the times that he didn't. Well, no, I don't need to, because I can give a general, feeling without having to mention absolutely every single time that Hitler said he didn't like the Jews. It's not required that I mention absolutely everything. So it's like, well, he's cherry-picking information. It's like, no, he's filtering out the information that's important to the book to portray the thing. He may have read a lot more, right? Or I say he, it's actually 2 authors. They may have read a lot more on the subject, but they can't put everything into one book. It's not physically possible. It's not humanly possible, right? It's not possible. So we can't. So it's not cherry picking. That's a very cynical way of looking at it. It's just the reality of history theory, okay? So what they're doing is filtering in the information, and that's why you need to read as many books on the topic as possible, of all calibers. So some of the German sources in this case, some of the Soviet sources, mix of the two, historians, primary sources, secondary sources. You need to read as many as possible and immerse yourself in the thing. That's what you have to do in order to mitigate the problem of the fact that we are all limited in our perspective. And he goes on, so at the same time he's cherry-picked the information and quietly suppressed other important historical data. Would be nice if he actually said what that historical data was, but he doesn't say that, so this point can't really be taken too seriously. For a professor who prides himself as a war historian, bearing in mind there is 2 authors, he has very little understanding of soldiers' combat or war outside what is written in books. So basically this is a gatekeeping, it's called, where he says you have to be a soldier in order to write about war. Bearing in mind that this book is talking about the historiography after the war, and so being a soldier by the same logic that Sudviks has, but this is the very same logic, that means that a soldier or whatever doesn't know about historiography because he's not a historian. So the historians know about the historiography after the war. So by your own logic, Sudvik, the historians are correct in what they're saying. Right? But also, you don't need to be a soldier to, so in order to give a review on Amazon, right, on a history book, you need to be a historian. Does that sound reasonable? Oh, I've never worked in McDonald's, but I'm going to tell you that McDonald's is rubbish and is cheap food and shouldn't be eaten unless you're dying, literally. Then, oh, well, no, you've never worked there, you can't make that, or something. What? It doesn't. What logic is that? If that was the case, it's like, well, as soon as we have history books written by soldiers, that's it. We can't do any more. We can't assess them. We can't say, wait, are the soldiers lying or anything? No, we can't do any of that. Oh, look, 2 soldiers say completely opposite things, but I can't point that out because I wasn't there. It's just, it's pathetic reasoning. In one location, he used an anecdote. Right, I love this. This is brilliant. In one location, he used an anecdote as an authoritative source for his accusation that the soldiers loved the first Kevlar helmet because it looked like the World War II German helmets. Okay, so just a bit of context on this. So the American military introduced a helmet for their soldiers that looked like the German World War II helmets. And in this book, it pretty much says, yeah, the American soldiers were like, oh, cool, we look like German soldiers from World War II. Right, something like that. So he's saying, well, he used an anecdote as an authoritative source for this accusation. Okay, let's just stick with that. And then this is the next sentence. This is simply not true. That's a statement of pointlessness. I was present when it was issued. Okay. Oh, wait a second. So we've got this guy, the Sudviks, accusing these authors of using an anecdotal source for this claim, and the refutation of that claim is an anecdotal source because Sudviks apparently, anecdotally, was in the American army when it was issued. So basically, he's saying, you're wrong for using an anecdote when I am also going to use an anecdote to refute you. It's like that. The logic, there's no logic, right? Logic doesn't exist. It's contradictory. By the same logic, he has undermined his own thing. Also, all sources are anecdotal, technically, because they're all made by people and they're flawed human beings, etc., etc. What you need to do is bring all the information together. And, if you pile up tons of information, that kind of generally says, well, this probably happened. And this book does that effectively. It says, hey, look, there's loads of different examples here. One of them is this with a helmet, but there's also tons of others that we're going to provide in the book. That all gives this general impression, yes, this myth exists. They've done that, and this guy's saying, no, it's anecdotal. Like, okay, all right. But then refutes that by giving an anecdotal testimony. He says, I was present when it was issued. 1, my unit didn't like it until it proved to be combat effective. The authors state that as a whole, the American military did this, right? So his refutation to that is his unit. Doesn't say what unit it was in, right? So his unit could have been one squad, as far as we know. Instead, let's say the authors, I don't know what they did, let's say they said a division or something said this. This guy saying, my unit didn't like it. It's like, okay, American military, millions of people strong, 50 guys said that they didn't like it, therefore we've refuted it. It's like, again, anecdotal evidence. Don't know anyone who relished and loved it because it... Right, but that's the exact same point you just made there. 1 and 2 are the same point. Right? Your unit didn't care, but some of the other units in the American army might have cared. So this isn't a refutation, this is just anecdotal and we can dismiss it, which is what I am doing. He blanketly accuses anyone of idealizing and romancing the German military and Nazi regime. And then he says it makes it clear that they are the same. For purchasing any books studying German military actions, exploring possible outcomes of what-if scenarios. What he's saying is anybody who purchases a book or studies the German military and talks about it and does what-if scenarios, he says that the authors accuse every single one of them of idealizing and romancing the German military and the Nazis, who are the same thing, right? Okay. In the introduction to this book, it says, Chapter 4 examines how the myth of the clean Wehrmacht in the East during the Second World War was brought to the general public in the United States by a series of widely selling memoirs written by former generals such as Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, Hans Rudel, blah, 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 and novels such as Sven Hassel and popular histories like those written by Paul Carroll. The chapter also debunks many of the myths, especially those propagated by Manstein and Carroll. Chapter 4 examines and debunks the myths developed by the German generals. Chapter 5 explores more specifically just what messages the German generals in their early publications and the lower ranking officers and ordinary German soldiers said in their memoirs. Chapter 6 examines the gurus. These authors, mostly but not exclusively American, have picked up and disseminated the myths of the Wehrmacht in a wide variety of popular publications that romanticize the German struggle in Russia. The gurus, men like Mark Jürger, Richard Landwehr, that guy, and Franz Kurowski, who I have actually tackled myself, who insist on authenticity in their writings, combine a painfully accurate knowledge of the details of the Wehrmacht, ranging from vehicles to uniforms to medals, with a romantic heroization of the German army fighting to save Europe from a rapacious communism. There is little in the way of historical context in the writings of these men. They honour particularly the soldiers of the Waffen-SS without bothering to tell us of the war of racial enslavement and annihilation these men pursued in the East. Chapter 7, we examine the popular culture of what we have termed the romancers, that is, a wide subculture of Americans who have embraced the message of the gurus and indulged in wargaming, internet chatting to a degree that reveals an identification with the values of courage, honour and self-sacrifice they see in the German soldier in World War II. So what Sudviks is saying, and what a lot of these critics are saying, is that anybody who buys books, studies the German military actions, and explores possible outcomes of what-if scenarios and plays games and all that stuff, all of them are therefore idealising and romancing the German military and the Nazi regime. No, what it is, these guys are criticising the gurus, right, who have populated the myth of the clean Wehrmacht and the fact that, because to take Franz Kurowski and Werner Hapt as two great examples where I've covered in previous videos, these guys will not tell you at all about the German executions of civilians or of the concentration camps, prior to the Soviets moving in, right? As the German army is retreating, the German army went in, took out the campmates and forced them on marches or killed them or whatever else and destroyed the camps before the Red Army took them. Won't mention any of that. Nothing like that at all. But they will mention if the Soviets did any atrocities at all. Right? Oh, they shot some prisoners. We'll mention that, but we won't mention any of the horrors that the Wehrmacht committed. So that's what these gurus are doing. They are whitewashing the Wehrmacht. They are saying, look at these cool tanks, and every division the Wehrmacht has was amazingly superior. They're all Panzer divisions. They're all this. They had shiny medals. They were the best thing in the universe. They were saving Europe from communism, etc. And again, not mentioning the war of racial enslavement and annihilation. And then what they're doing is the romancers then go, ooh, I like what the gurus are saying, and we're going to take that on, right? So they embrace the message of the gurus. They embrace the German Wehrmacht. They embrace the Nazi regime. And then they go and buy books, study the German military actions and whatever. So it's not me, for example, with a bunch of history books, looking at this topic and trying to find the truth. It's people who are they are borderline Nazi. If they're not already Nazi, they are borderline Nazi because they are worshipping the Wehrmacht as the greatest fighting force that has ever existed, even though that is the myth propagated at the time by the propaganda of the racist Third Reich. Okay, that's what they're doing. The reason why the Wehrmacht is the greatest fighting force in the world, supposedly, is because the Germans are superior soldiers. Superior soldiers, eh? Why do they think that they are superior? It's because they are Nazi. They are racist, right? They think the Germans, as a race, are superior to the Slavs of the East. And so they say the German soldier was superior to the Slavics of the East. And you hear that time and time again in the German general memoirs, in the German Wehrmacht veterans like Werner Hapt and Kurowski or whoever else it is, all the historians like that, and the old day historians, they all propagated this myth that the German Wehrmacht was superior to the Soviets. And then you get people embracing this message. And then you get the myth, the Russian hordes that we faced. There were so many of them. We were just swamped. What's that one? One of the historians said we were drowning under... The German divisions were drowning under like rocks under the sea as the Soviet rifle, basically a wash of Soviet riflemen came over them. Well, the reality is they were only outnumbered like 3-1. And then you get... Well, that means... And then you get... Yeah, what's his name? Mr. Askey. I need to deal with him. I said that years ago. I will deal with him eventually. But yeah, this TIK guy doesn't understand what being outnumbered 3-1 means. Yeah, okay. Anyway, the point is, it's not people who study the history or play the games or whatever. It's the people who embrace what is basically almost Nazi culture. If not, it is Nazi culture. And by the way, yes, the German military and the Nazi regime are the same thing. Turns out the German Wehrmacht was an element, let's say, an entity that was part of the Nazi regime. Because without the Nazi regime, you wouldn't have, or any state, without the state, you don't have an army, right? There's only two ways to get an army. Private army, let's say I pay for somebody to fight for me, that's called a private army. The state, though, creates its own army, and in this case, it created the Wehrmacht. And as part of the Wehrmacht, you have the Nazi regime. It's one of the same. Hitler even says this, I think it's in Mein Kampf, might not be Mein Kampf, but he says the ultimate entity of socialism is the army, right? The ultimate part of the state is the army, and that's the thing. So the German army is the state, and the state, it's an extension of the state, and the Nazi regime is the state. So it's the same thing, okay? So they are the same, and yeah. So people are romanticizing about the Nazi army, but they're not Nazis or anything, right? It's like, hold on, wait a sec, what's going on there, right? So then he says, while in his introduction, he boasts that he was enthralled by the same books and games he condemns, while he explains this was part of his journey, no other person is afforded this courtesy. Okay, wouldn't it be much simpler, instead of having to go on a journey of, let's read Guderian and Manstein, because I did the same. Let's read Guderian, Manstein, Hapt, and whoever else. Let's read them, take in all this pro-Nazi stuff, right, and then realise that that was a load of rubbish, and actually the reality was a lot different. And then, go on the journey and realise that that is the case. Instead of doing that, why don't we just tell people, hey, this is what what the myth used to be. This is why it is a myth. You don't have to read that stuff, or if you do, just be careful with it, because it is propagating a myth that has been debunked. There you go. So now you don't have to go on this journey. You can not waste your time going on that journey. You can go on a different journey yourself. I don't see what the problem is with that. While he accuses popular culture of idealising the German military, he conveniently forgets that popular culture incessantly portrays evil regimes with German military Nazi uniforms and behaviours. Yes, but some people are not seeing it like that. And they are pointing it out in the book. And you're now condemning them for that? I don't get it. Sun Tzu has a very good saying about knowing yourself and knowing your enemy. It is too long to put here. It's actually not. The phrase is Sun Tzu said, know yourself and know your enemy, and you shall not lose 1,000 battles, right? So you may as well have put that in there, because it's almost as long as you typing that out. The fact is, I don't think you actually knew what the phrase was. The author has mistaken the military's application of this principle as a desire to idealise and romance the German military. No, you've misunderstood what the book is about. The book is saying that people have embraced not only the German tactics and World War II, they have embraced basically what is Nazism. They have basically embraced that. That's what they're saying. And it's dangerous, because it might not be full-on Nazism, but it's so close it may as well be. If you are a military veteran, you may find this book laughable and irritating. And if you are a historian, you'll find this review laughable and irritating. He freely hands out condemnation and criticism for just about everyone. No, he doesn't. He doesn't do this. This is where he has gone wrong. This guy, Sudvigs, has gone wrong. The authors do not condemn everybody. They don't. They just condemn those who are embracing the neo-Nazism. That's what they're condemning. I've read it out. They make it very clear that's what they're doing. Bottom line, he asserts that he is the only one who understands the true German military and anything related to the subject, and if you do not agree with him, well, you are a Wehrmacht romantic. That is not true at all. At all. I did not get that impression from this book at all. So, this review, sorry, most of your points, in fact all your points, are worthless, essentially. So, we've tackled one of the reviews, and we're going to do another one in a second, but I want to point something out. So, the way history works is you have two sides to an argument. There could be more, there could be loads of different arguments, but let's just go with two just to keep it simple. And the way it works is you have a back and forth, right? They both argue back and forth until one side wins. Now, how do you win an argument? So you could insult each other, but as we know, that doesn't really work. So we don't do that. We say, no, we're going to have a civil discussion. What we end up doing is we say, okay, this side has got more evidence. Okay, so now they've got more evidence, so that probably suggests that this other side is going to lose, right? Unless this other side has got a better interpretation of the evidence that they do have, and possibly that could be better, right? Or one side could have all the evidence and the interpretation, like a good, solid interpretation that makes logical sense, and so that side would win, right? And it goes back and forth, and over time you could have, hey, the moon is made of cheese. No, it isn't. Yes, it is, so here's some evidence. No, it really isn't. Here's a lot more evidence and interpretation, etc. And it goes back and forth until eventually one side wins and you go, oh yeah, the moon isn't made of cheese. We've all won, right? We've all learned a lesson. In history, it's a bit more difficult than that, but the point is the same, that you win the argument through logical reason, evidence, and interpretation. Now, what happens on this channel is that people refute me by responding to me, and then their arguments are pretty much like these. They don't make logical sense, they contradict themselves, they're not very convincing, the evidence is meh. I mean, there might be some evidence in it, but if I sat there and really went through it, I could probably, like I've done here, I can just go dissect it and say that doesn't really make any sense, there's logical contradictions, etc. The interpretation isn't correct, whatever it is. Now that, as a variety of subjects, that's always happened. So what people do, they make a response. I don't respond for ever, because why would I to a really bad comment? I don't especially ones where they swear and shout and call me pathetic and tell me to neck myself. Why would I respond to those comments? Why would I do that? Currently people are telling me that I'm mentally ill. Okay, great. Doesn't dispute what I'm saying though, right? So there will probably be comments coming back at me in this video in the comment section, and again, a lot of them won't hold up to scrutiny, right? They seem impressive at first glance, and that's the whole point. At first glance they do, but then when you actually look at them and start going, wait a second, that doesn't, is that really the case? You start devouring their foundation and it just falls apart. And so, yeah, there might be a few refuting comments in the comment section or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their views hold up to scrutiny or that I couldn't refute them. So I wanted to point that out, because the point is that, if these guys want to try and fight back and convince me that no, the Wehrmacht really was this superior force in World War II, that's fine. You need to make arguments that stand up to scrutiny, that provide evidence and a solid interpretation that is not refutable if we sat there for a while and actually, went back and forth. Because that's the thing, a lot of people come out with stuff and it seems impressive, right? It seems really impressive at the start, but when you actually sit there and if I'm not convinced by it, then there's a problem with it, right? If I've got more evidence behind me or wherever, if I've got more evidence or better interpretation and I'm not convinced by the contradictory nature of the argument presented against me, then I won't be convinced by it. So, you've wasted your time in effect. And this is what these lot are doing, that they're just spouting a load of stuff. What about this? What about that? And making accusations that don't really hold up. And then when they get called out for it, it's like, oh, and that's the thing, that it doesn't work. And we're going to see that in a second again with another review. So Magnitude says, not the war I know and not worth your time or money. Please don't construe this rating or review to be a defense of a pro-German mindset in World War II literature or certain subcultures of society. Okay, we won't do that. Rather, this important topic is weakly argued in this book and undercut by several methodological issues and matters of interpretation. Ooh, so we're going to get a decent review, right? In brief, the authors argue that German generals and soldiers were allowed to shape the narrative about their war on the Eastern Front, starting in 1946. Correct. 100%. Americans, the authors claim, have a favourable view of the USSR as our ally during World War II, but this all changed when the USSR became USA's Cold War enemy. True. The image of the German Wehrmacht as a heroic, noble fighting force, disassociated from Hitler and the crimes of his regime, became a myth that, the authors claim, has contributed continues to survive and thrive in the minds of the American public today. True. Not entirely. That doesn't mean everybody in America believes this. It's just there's a wide swath of society that does it. Let's say it might be a minority, but it is a certain percentage. Right? The authors clearly established that there are books that have a pro-German slant, right? And books that focus on German military matters to such an extent that these books ignore the larger and more troubling political context and complicity in war crimes. The authors also established that there are games that feature German propaganda artwork from World War II, internet forums that focus on German military prowess to the exclusion of all else, and even contemporary Americans who dress up as SS soldiers on the weekends. None of this is in dispute. So at this moment, none of that is in dispute. So he admits that that is actually what's happening. However, the author's argument fails in several respects. 1. They do not prove the popularity of the views, books, or activities that they analyse with data such as polling responses, sales figures, or some other measure. Then goes on, their argument is that a wide majority of the American public buys or participates in these things, and yet their examples focus on subcultures, bored war gamers, internet chat room participants interested in the German military in World War II, and World War II reenactors. They never establish how many people participate in these events or read the book in question. Indeed, the fact that these groups are actually subcultures suggests that such beliefs are in the minority. Even within these subcultures, such beliefs may not be uniformly believed. More on this below. But the problem with polls is that, you see it on the adverts all the time. 78% of women think that this makeup makes them look 10 years younger, and they've polled like 250 people. It's like, yeah, well, duh. Well, that's not going to, what kind of poll is that, right? So you need a proper poll where they ask everybody in America. It's not going to happen, and also it's not going to be very accurate, even if it did happen. So that, again, it's like, calling them out on this is like, it doesn't. You can't use that as a sort of, that's a refutation of what they're saying. There is, and I can tell you on my channel, it happens all the time. There is a subculture of people who think the Wehrmacht is the most amazing. They'll be in the comments of this video. They will be in the comments of this video. The reviews are full of them on Amazon. They're full of them. This subculture does exist. And so saying it does exist and then refuting it because, it might not be the majority. It might not be the majority. Let's say it's 30%, 20%, 10%. It still exists, and it's dangerous because it's propagating a myth of German superiority, and I mean German in the sense of race and in sense of National Socialism. It's propagating that myth. So it needs to be called out, and it is being called out in this book, and you're refuting that by saying that, well, they should have done a poll. Right, okay, no. So their argument is that the wide majority of American public buys or participates in these things. Well, they might do, but they might not do. But that's not necessarily the point. The point is a huge portion do. That's the point. So yeah, the rest of this is pretty much the same. Interestingly, the authors do not evaluate the impact of movies in this review of American popular culture because, when you mention anything about World War II, you have to mention everything. I didn't know that. People call me out, oh, you didn't mention the Treaty of Versailles. When I said, the old myth and the old reasons for Hitler going to war don't really make sense without this reason I'm going to point out to you today. Oh, well, I didn't mention the Treaty of Versailles. It's like, yeah, but I did mention all the old things that, the old traditional narrative, which includes the Treaty of Versailles, but I didn't say the words Treaty of Versailles. Well, because I didn't mention that, my views are invalid. Even though what I said in that video, which is the why Hitler had to go to war, that extra reason that I gave, which basically is like if you imagine a spider web, it's the center of the spider web. So without it, the rest of them doesn't make any sense. But with it, it all now makes sense. It's like, oh, but you didn't mention the Treaty of Versailles. It's like, yeah, but I knew it existed. And I know that I don't treat the viewer as if they're stupid. I think you know what the Treaty of Versailles is. The point what I was saying was, without this other reason, the Treaty of Versailles and all the old reasons don't make any sense. But I didn't mention the Treaty of Versailles, therefore it gives them an opportunity to refute it. Now, if I had mentioned the Treaty of Versailles, they'd say, well, you didn't mention this movie, and that's what they're doing here. It's a what about this-ism. It's an aboutism. And that's what they're doing here. That's what this review is doing. Well, they didn't mention movies, so therefore this refutes this. It's like, no, it doesn't. You can't mention everything in one book, right? It's just impossible. Certainly there may be good German soldier portrayals ranging from the Young Lions to Cross of Iron. So there we go. We've got two examples here. So he's basically undermining his own argument. But then there's a movie such as Enemy at the Gates, which actually portrays the Germans as pretty decent soldiers who are slaughtering the Red Army hordes, right? Because, that's that famous scene in the movie, which I've tackled already once before, and I'll be tackling it again next week, where it says, one guy with the rifle picks up a rifle, the other guy got the bullets, and then when the guy with the rifle dies, the other guy puts the bullets in and starts shooting, right? And they all run at the German lines, because let's not forget, when you're fighting an urban war, what you need to do is all run at the enemy like stupid idiots, right? When the super efficient German Wehrmacht is there with the tanks and the machine guns, and they just start mowing down the Red Army riflemen, and then when the riflemen turn back and get shot in return, right? That's how the war is portrayed, right? So the Germans are amazing supermen who can stand in a line and shoot idiots running at them who've not armed properly, right? And the Russians had hundreds of thousands of men who they could just throw at the enemy, and they had unlimited Red Army hordes. And the Russians are cruel and evil because they shoot their own men, whereas the Germans aren't quite that bad. Although there is that German sniper who does hurt the kid, but. Yeah, the Germans are evil, but only sort of evil, not as bad as the Russians. That is your movie that you're going to go to show how this isn't see, Enemy of the Gates is a great film, is historically accurate. Like, really? Indeed, the importance of Stalingrad as cultural metaphor for Soviet resolve and myth making is on its own potentially huge and yet overlooked by the authors. I'm literally doing a Stalingrad documentary at the minute. I've done tons of videos on Stalingrad. And yeah, okay, the Soviets had a myth as well. Guess what? We don't embrace the myth that the Soviets brought up, right? But not embracing the myth that the Soviets brought up does not mean that we then embrace the German myth, right? There's a problem here. We don't embrace any myths, okay? So the Soviets have their myths as well, and maybe if these two authors decided to write The Myth of the Eastern book, Part 2, the Nazi-German War from a different perspective, from the Soviet perspective, yes, they could easily write a book saying, hey, yes, the Soviet censors were bad, the Soviets' myth-making was just as bad as the Germans, but that's the whole point. Both sides did the myth-making thing, right? And this book is focusing on the German side. The fact that I'm having to point this out is proof that you've not quite grasped this. 2. The authors overlooked the amount of Soviet-focused research that came out since the fall of the USSR. One of the big problems that I have is that not enough of this stuff has come out. Yes, more has come out since the fall of the USSR. Great. Not enough has come out. Not enough has come out. I'd done the Curlin series, and I knew, and I said it, I think, in the video, right? As I'm doing this, I know that I am using too many German sources. I cannot, there's not enough Soviet material out yet for me to use to make this documentary correct. So in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, whenever that people start making Curlin pocket videos, books and stuff, people will say TIK's documentary is incorrect because he used too many German sources. And I'm saying this at the time because I don't have access to it, right? This stuff, and yeah, I had to rely on Hapt and Kurowski and all these other guys. They're down there, and I had to use them. But even as I'm using them, I'm going, this doesn't make any sense. This is another myth. I know this is a myth. I can't necessarily prove it, but I can kind of tell. I can, my knowledge of how they lie about things, I can kind of tell that this is a myth, right? So I was saying that in the video. But the point is that these authors haven't overlooked it, but it's still, the Soviet-focused research is coming out. It's not fully out yet, right? We're only dipping our toe into it. So you still have a German-dominated perspective of the Second World War, which is partly why this channel has been so successful in some senses, because I've been pointing this out. Hey guys, these old myths don't make sense. This is why, right? So, yeah, this argument doesn't work. And also, the point is, right, this is 80 years or something now after the Second World War, right? And a lot of people still have the old myth view. They have not read the new stuff. They don't trust the new stuff because they say the Soviets, you can't trust the Soviets. That's what they say. They tell me all the time, this guy uses the Soviet sources, you cannot trust him, right? Because I use Soviet and German sources, right? So I use both because that's what you're meant to do. You're meant to use as many sources as possible to try and get away from the bias as much as possible, even though we're all biased, etc. But you try and use as many sources as possible. So I use all the sources. So by doing that, apparently, right, these people say that I'm untrustworthy because I'm using, precisely for the reason that I'm using the Soviet-focused research, which you're now saying that has come out recently. It's like, yeah, okay, it's come out recently, but the myth still applies. And this book is showing the historiography, the evolution of the myth, right? From the war to now, right? That's what they're doing. So they're not overlooking it. They're saying the myth still exists. Yes, this research has come out. It hasn't destroyed the myth yet properly. Generally, their account of the myth of the Eastern Front is missing an explanation of why the Soviet version of events got buried in this country in the years since the Second World War. No, they make it very clear they didn't have access to the Soviet sources because the Soviets censored and blocked their sources from being used by Western authors, right? And this guy, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he goes into this. It's like they say that. Now, the point is, what they're saying is that, okay, so then they had to use a German-orientated perspective, and they even went, but the problem is that the American military embraced it. They were like, please, Halder, let me kiss you, right? That's what they did, okay? So they embraced Halder to the point of extremity, right? I'll give you another example. One of the books up there is Schirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. That book is pretty much written by Halder. I know it says Schirer on the front cover, but at least one point I can remember in the book, he goes, I'm not sure about this. Let me just ring my good mate Halder and let me just ask him, hey Halder, he's just like, I've just got off the phone to Halder and he said this. The whole book is written from Halder's perspective. Halder wins a medal for his contribution. So the American military just like, please Halder, give us more information. And Halder was like, oh yeah, it was definitely that madman Hitler's fault, even though I screwed up during Fall Blau completely, and Barbarossa, and several other points in the war, and I didn't understand the economic and political aspects of this war, blah, 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 blah. It's all madman Hitler's fault. And it's like, right, okay. So the point is that the Americans embraced the pro-German outlook and the neo-Nazi outlook, and then they obviously couldn't access the Soviet sources because the Soviets blocked it, but that's not a refutation of what the authors are saying, right? What are you trying to say? So, okay, so the Soviets blocked their own access, so therefore the American military, yeah, it's no wonder they became neo-Nazi. Like, what? No. Just because the Soviets blocked their sources doesn't mean you have to necessarily go, yes, Halder, we believe everything you say. And start raising sort of Nazi views. No, you don't have to do that. right? You don't do that. That's not what you do, okay? And so, yeah, I don't really quite get what this guy's trying to say here. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But then he goes on. And then he says, were the post-war memoirs of Guderian and von Manstein any different from those of Zhukov and Chuikov? No, Chuikov and Zhukov's memoirs are bad. They are bad. But so are Guderian and von Manstein. However, when I point this out, you will have people defending either side. If you are Marxist Socialist, love the Soviet Union, you'll be defending Zhukov and Chuikov's memoirs, right? Completely. Like, yeah, I love Chuikov and Zhukov. Guderian and von Manstein, if I said their sources are bad, you'll have people defending them, right? That's what they did when I had the super sarcastic video where I said Manstein wants to retreat all the way to Berlin and that's how you win the war, right? So that is what you get. You get people in the comments saying, no, Guderian and Manstein were right, and Zhukov and Chuikov are right. And the point is they're not. None of them are right. Not on their own, okay? Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't some elements of it that has some element of truth to it, like, World War II happened, of course, yeah, but the point is you can't rely on them alone because no source in particular is oh so trustworthy. That's the point. But Guderian and Manstein were playing on the fact that you couldn't access the Soviet sources and that the American public didn't trust the the Soviet sources at all. They didn't trust it. So Guderian and von Manstein were pretty much saying, oh, the Americans want to know that the Russians are subhuman and they can easily defeat them. Brilliant. Let's write a book that says how great the German military was. And by the way, if you wear the German helmet type things and you do what the German generals kind of did, right, and actually do it without Madman Hitler, you will win the next war, which is the Cold War. And the Americans are like, this is a brilliant strategy. We will embrace you, love you for a long time, Guderian. Right? And that's pretty much what happened. So, yeah, the memoirs of Guderian and von Manstein are tailored towards the American audience and not very trustworthy, but neither are Zhukov and Chuikov either fully. Chuikov's memoirs were censored quite heavily, and so was Zhukov's. So, yeah, it's true, but both sides aren't trustworthy. What's more surprising is that the authors themselves did not consult the vast amount of research that has come out since the fall of the Soviet Union. That does not disprove that the myth was already there. For example, they cite one article from David Glantz from 1970, which is right in the middle of their era, what they're talking about. Okay, World War II happened in 1945, now it's 2008 when this happened. So that time period, 1945 to 2008, I think 1970 comes within that. Yeah? Oh, yeah, it does. Okay, so that's fine. Similarly, they do not cite any of Anthony Beevor's books. You're trying to say that Anthony Beevor's book or books are more balanced when he has quite clearly got a pro-German slant because he's highly reliant on the German sources. Like that, this in fact actually undermines what you're saying, okay? As a historiography of the Eastern Front, their book is more appropriate to the state of affairs in 1978 or 1998, not 2008. So he's saying it's out of date, but I still think it's important in 2008, and I still think it's important in 2019. The authors never address the diversity of opinions or presentations within the subcultures they do and analyse. Okay, so for example, Americans enjoy reenacting as American soldiers, not just German ones. Don't recall American soldiers going on the Eastern Front and deliberately starving millions of people or shipping them off to the slave labour camps of the Reich. So reenacting as... I'm not saying American, the USA in World War II is squeaky clean. Probably not. But, right, they weren't... It's not quite on the scale of what the Germans did in World War II. Plus, again, if let's say Americans reenacted the Civil War, which was a brutal conflict, okay, the American Civil War was a brutal conflict. Okay, what they're not doing when they do the German reenactments, okay, is they're not showing that the Germans are actually brutal killers of prisoners, civilians, Jews, enslaving people, brutal racist, superior human beings, supposedly. They're not showing that. They're just kind of, oh yeah, we're fighting each other. That's not quite right, okay? They are going purely from a military perspective. Let's ignore the politics and economics. You cannot do that. You are propagating myths, right? I know that the vast majority of people who disagree with me tell me to stick to tanks because they don't like the fact that I keep bringing up, hey, look at the slaves that the Germans got, right? There's one comment today, in fact, I read a comment, the guy was saying, I can't watch this video all the way through, it's too brutal, I can't listen to how the Germans treated the Soviet prisoners of war, because they killed 3.3 million of them, right? He was like, I can't get all the way through. It's the first video I can't get all the way through because it's too brutal, right? I'm showing that, hey, this is how the German Wehrmacht treated their prisoners of war. And this guy couldn't get through it. And a lot of people were saying, oh my, I didn't realize how bad this is. Because you're not getting that with a reenactment, because they're not showing that side of it. And these guys are saying, and you'll see it in the comment section of this video, people will say, the German Wehrmacht didn't do that. It was the SS, or it was this, or it was that. It's like, no, it was the Wehrmacht. Again, you know, and so when you see these reenactors, okay, they're showing it from a purely, you know, military point of view, but that's the problem. That's the problem. You can't do that and portray a proper, real perspective of World War II. The point of the matter is the German soldiers were racist. They believed they were superior to the Slavic peoples of the East. That's the whole point, right? They thought they could knock down the door and the whole thing would rot and, you know, come down, and they could easily get the Slavs, the slaves of the East. That's why the origin of the word Slav is basically slaves, right? Because the Slavic peoples were like serfs back in the day. And so the Germans wanted their own serfs on the Eastern Front. That's why they were going east. They wanted the land, the resources, and the slaves for their empire. That's what they were doing. So to portray the German soldiers as just purely from a military perspective is not correct, especially when you portray it as from the Waffen-SS. You know. Also, there's plenty of images of Guderian and German soldiers in war game boxes. There are also images of Patron, you know, that great colonizer of the East, Patron. Sorry, just what? And even the occasional Soviet general or soldier. Look, Soviets are bad, Americans aren't squeaky clean, Germans are bad. Pointing this out is reality, right? So the British soldier, because people will be in the comment section again saying, you're British, the British Empire did this. Yes, the British government does things bad. That's why I'm against the British government as a British person, because I'm not insane, right? I love the British government, I'm just going to not think about it. No, the British government is evil, it's an evil entity, it has committed crimes against humanity. True. Yes, they did starve Indians in World War II. True. Did they do it deliberately? I don't think so. I think it's just incompetence, but it happened. Great. That does not take away the fact that the Germans also committed crimes on an unimaginable larger scale, and the Soviets also did. The point is that, yes, lots of people, no side is squeaky clean. True. However, that does not dismiss the point that, you know, there are people trying to say, no, the Wehrmacht didn't do all these crimes that they actually committed. That's wrong, right? The Eastern Front is a brutal ideological war of extermination for both sides. So they both committed lots of crimes. We need to just accept that, right? You just need to accept that and deal with it, and also not try and whitewash one side or another, or say they were evil and they're not, and or they're evil and they're not. No, just embrace the fact that both sides are fighting a brutal ideological war and neither side is correct, okay? That's how we should view this Eastern Front, at least. Similarly, when playing the Soviets in a well-balanced war game, one can badly beat the Germans. Yeah, because it's not balanced, is it? Something the authors never acknowledge as a possible or desired outcome. And it certainly is desired by a Soviet player. While it may be that war games often allow for play focused on alternative historical outcomes absent of political realities, yeah, because this is the issue here, the same is just as true for a Soviet player. Yes, that's true, but this book is not tackling the Soviet myth, it's tackling the German myth. So what this guy's trying to do is go, see, they didn't mention the Soviets being evil, right? Because the Soviets are evil. Therefore, right, it's like, what about this? That's what he's doing. What about this? What about this? It's like, stop doing that. That's not an argument. The Soviets were evil. True. So are the Germans. This book is focused on the German evilness, right? Because there's plenty of books written for the American audience telling you how bad the Soviet system was because it was awful, right? So, yeah, if there was a part 2 and this part 2 said about the Soviet myth, would this make you happy, right? I don't get it, right? As soon as you mention anything in World War II, you've got to say, well, all sides committed crimes. If you didn't do that, they'd be there, aha, proof, right? No. In other words, in a purely military simulation of the Eastern Front, both the German and Soviet player are potentially ignoring many awful political realities of their respective dictators and regimes. Glad we're in agreement with that. Eastern Front military war games often ignore all political factors and not just German ones. Exactly. This is the problem. Lastly, it should be emphasized that many of these hobbyists, whatever side they are playing, pay a great amount of attention to historical accuracy. Not if they're missing out the political and economic side of the war. That's the point. So people are saying to me, stick to tanks. You can't stick to tanks. It's not possible if you want historic accuracy. And I keep saying this, and people are like, oh, stick to tanks. Like it's like the go-to card, you know. Hitler's a madman, stick to tanks. It's like, stop it. It's stupid. If you want historical accuracy, you need to bring in the brutalization of the Eastern Front, and that includes the political and economic aspects to it. Number 4, the authors also assume that the readers of these books and participants in these hobbies do not do any other research or reading outside of the items presented here. For example, the authors seem to suggest that Holocaust literature and research is limited to academia. Right, a lot of these people who propagate the myth that the clean Wehrmacht was a thing and didn't participate in the mass atrocities on the Eastern Front, etc., how many do you think are also Holocaust deniers? I've got a feeling it's more than a couple, right? They kind of go hand in hand. Now, not all reenactors, gamers, blah, 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 who are embracing the Halder myth, let's say, are necessarily Holocaust deniers. That might not be true. However, there is going to be a subset of the subculture, and part of the thing is, well, if you believe in the racial superiority of the German Wehrmacht soldiers, which is the whole point, right? Because all the German generals did was miss out the racial part. Yeah, those German soldiers are superior. What kind of superior? Oh, racial superior. Okay, got you. Right. That's what they've missed out. So they have basically said, you know, the racial superior. How far from that are they from National Socialism? Actual National Socialism. Pretty close, right? Pretty close. So they're skirting around it. Franz Kurowski was pretty much a Nazi. Werner Haupt was a German veteran in the war in Army Group North, I think it was, or Army Group Center. And he's there breaking down doors, right? Well, I don't know if he himself did it, but he probably did, because the point of the matter is, if they weren't marched east, they had to live off the land, so they had to steal this food off the civilians. They had to do that. So, do you think Werner Haupt was super innocent in the war? No. So he is probably a Nazi. You get the impression reading him, if you just added in race a couple of times in his text, it would literally be Nazi propaganda, right? So this is how close they are to this. So, do you think these people who are reading this, who are then ignoring the Soviet sources, right? Do you think, and ignoring the political and economic situation, which you have admitted that that's what they're doing, are going to be reading Holocaust literature? Do you really think that? I'm not so sure about that. The impact of the Holocaust on American thinking about Germany in World War II goes unexamined here, and that seems incredibly short-sighted. So, you're saying that it's okay for German Wehrmacht reenactors to ignore the political and economic situation, but not not historians of the German myth of the clean Wehrmacht in World War II, when they do in fact point out the fact that the point that they're getting at is that the Wehrmacht wasn't clean and did participate in these atrocities. Like, it doesn't, like, I'm sorry, your argument doesn't make any sense. A book such as Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, right, so he's basically saying the book's out there. Ta-da! It's like, yes, there are, that doesn't mean they've read them, right? So that's, your own argument is flawed by your own logic from before. The authors do not address the former or all the similar books, blah, 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 right? From Anne Frank's diary. Again, I don't necessarily think that these people have read Anne Frank's diary. I don't think they have. I really don't. Because if you have read Holocaust literature, you're probably not going to be like, you know what, I'm going to don a Waffen-SS uniform and go out and pretend that everything is fine. Like, no, it's not going to happen, is it? However, how widely these viewpoints have been welcomed in the American public or even within the subcultures highlighted in this book remains unstabbed. So basically, because you cannot measure it, because it's impossible to, unless we did like an election to find, or a referendum to find out this, we will never know. So he's saying that the myth does exist, but because the authors didn't precisely figure out exactly how many people actually believe in this myth, that the book is worth 1 star. Really? These reviews, they're all the same. They're all terrible in their... And you can literally go through it sentence by sentence, as I've just done here, and go, no. Now, I'm not going to do that with the rest of them. There are plenty of reviews out there, and I would encourage you to read them so that you can kind of go, what? And I'm not saying this book is perfect. I'm not saying that. But if you want to pick it up, it's probably a 3 or 4 star, right, book. It's not a 1 star. I've deliberately picked the 1 star reviews here. It's more than that. And it does successfully tackle the myth. It explains the historiography. It's not perfect, but I've used it. I think it's good. It explains the Halder situation, right? And so for that, yeah, I think it's worth it. It is not a 1 star review. The reviews don't make any sense. And they are basically, these people have been called out for their beliefs, right? Because it is belief. They have been called out for their beliefs, and they are not happy with it, and so they're and I'll probably get flooded on this video as well. And it's just like, I'm sorry, you're going to have to come up with a very good argument to convince me that none of the problems on the Eastern Front were the result of the Wehrmacht. I mean, just saying it out loud, it makes me laugh. It's like, that is the most ridiculous. There's no way that you could argue this. There's just no way. The Wehrmacht was guilty as charged.